Before sharks prowled the oceans, before dinosaurs thundered across the land, before mammals and humans ever appeared, there was a world ruled by creatures that seem almost alien to us today. They had no jaws, no teeth as we know them, and yet they were armored like medieval knights. These were the Ostracoderms, the armored, jawless fishes of the Paleozoic seas. In this video, we will journey back nearly 500 million years to uncover their story. We will explore when and where they lived, what they looked like, how they survived, and why they eventually vanished. So, sit back and imagine yourself diving into the shallow seas of the Ordovician period. The water is murky, filled with drifting plankton. On the seafloor, strange armored shapes shuffle slowly, their heads encased in bony shields. These are the Ostracoderms, and their story is one of survival, adaptation, and ultimately extinction. But their legacy lives on in every vertebrate alive today, including us. The story of Ostracoderms begins in the Ordovician period around 500 million years ago. This was a time of extraordinary change in Earth history. The Cambrian explosion had already unleashed a dazzling variety of invertebrates. Trilobites scuttled across the seafloor, brachiopods anchored themselves in the sediment, and strange predators like Anomalocaris still haunted the oceans. But now, something new was happening: the rise of the vertebrates. Ostracoderms were among the earliest of these pioneers. They were not the first vertebrates. That honor goes to even more primitive jawless fishes, but they were the first to leave behind abundant, well-preserved fossils. Their bony armor ensured that their remains survived the ravages of time, giving us a detailed window into their world. For over 100 million years, Ostracoderms thrived. They survived through the Silurian and into the Devonian period. The Devonian is often called the Age of Fishes, and Ostracoderms were an important part of that story. They were not the dominant predators. That role belonged to the newly evolved jawed fishes, but they were a crucial part of the ecosystem, filling niches as filter, feeders, and bottom dwellers. To understand Ostracoderms, we need to picture the world they lived in. The continents were arranged very differently than today. Much of the land was clustered in the supercontinent Gondwana, while smaller landmasses drifted across the equator. Vast, shallow seas covered large areas, creating perfect habitats for marine life. The climate was warm, and oxygen levels in the oceans fluctuated. These conditions favored the evolution of new body plans and survival strategies. These shallow waters were the perfect home for the Ostracoderms. Most Ostracoderms lived in coastal shallows, estuaries, and river systems. Fossil evidence shows that they were especially abundant in areas where rivers met the sea, where currents carried sediments and organic matter. These environments provided both food and shelter. Unlike the sleek predators that would come later, Ostracoderms were not built for the open ocean. They lacked the speed and stamina to chase prey across vast distances. Instead, they preferred the calmer, shallower waters where they could sift through the sediment and feed at their own pace. Ostracoderms, with their armored bodies and specialized feeding methods, were one of nature's experiments in vertebrate design. The word ostracoderm is not the name of a single species, but a catch-all term for several groups of armored jawless fishes. These include the heterostracans, osteostracans, and anaspids, among others. Each group had its own unique body shape and adaptations, but all shared the common feature of heavy bony armor. Some Ostracoderm fossils have been found in what are now inland regions, far from the sea. This tells us that they were not strictly marine. They could also live in freshwater rivers and lakes. In fact, they may have been among the first vertebrates to colonize freshwater habitats. The most striking feature of Ostracoderms was their armor plating. Unlike modern fishes, which are covered in scales, Ostracoderms had thick bony shields covering their heads and front bodies. These shields were often decorated with ridges, grooves, and patterns, making each species unique. The armor served several purposes: protection. The armor shielded them from predators. Structural support. It gave their soft bodies rigidity. Mineral storage. Some scientists believe the armor acted as a reservoir for calcium and phosphate. Their skeletons were made of cartilage, not bone. This made them lighter, but also less durable. The armor compensated for this weakness. Ostracoderms also lacked jaws. Instead, they had simple mouths that could suck in water and sediment. Inside, muscular pharyngeal pouches filtered out food particles. This made them efficient filter feeders, but poor hunters. Most Ostracoderms also lacked paired fins. Without fins, they were clumsy swimmers, relying on their tails for propulsion. Some later groups, like the cephalaspids, developed small pectoral fins, which gave them better control and maneuverability. The head shields of some Ostracoderms were so large that they made up nearly half the animal's body length. Imagine a fish where the head is bigger than the rest of the body. That was the reality for some species. Ostracoderms were not predators. They did not chase down prey or bite into flesh. Instead, they were filter feeders and detritivores. They fed on plankton, microorganisms, and organic debris that settled on the seafloor. Their feeding method was simple but effective. They sucked in water and sediment through their mouths, then used their pharyngeal pouches to filter out the edible bits. The rest was expelled. This lifestyle may sound unglamorous, but it was essential to the ecosystem. By recycling organic matter, Ostracoderms helped maintain the balance of nutrients in the oceans. They were the cleaners of the Paleozoic seas. Some Ostracoderms had specialized grooves and channels on their head shields that may have helped direct water into their mouths. It's as if their armor doubled as a feeding aid, guiding food straight to their mouths. Life for an Ostracoderm was not easy. The Paleozoic seas were filled with predators, and Ostracoderms were slow and defenseless except for their armor. Their main predators were the newly evolved jawed fishes known as Placoderms. Placoderms were armored like Ostracoderms, but they had a crucial advantage: jaws. With powerful jaws lined with sharp plates, Placoderms could crush through shells and armor. To an Ostracoderm, a Placoderm was a nightmare predator. Another threat came from the Eurypterids, or sea scorpions. These giant arthropods could grow over 2 meters long with their powerful claws and venomous stingers. They were formidable hunters. Fossil evidence suggests that Eurypterids shared the same habitats as Ostracoderms, making encounters likely. Despite these dangers, Ostracoderms survived for millions of years. Evolution was testing out different designs, some of which would pave the way for future vertebrates. Some Ostracoderms had armor shaped like wings or horns. These strange shapes may have helped them stabilize in the water, or they may have been used for display, like the antlers of modern deer. The first Ostracoderm fossils were discovered in Europe during the 1830s. At that time, paleontology was still a young science. Fossil hunters and naturalists were collecting strange rocks and bones, often without fully understanding what they represented. When these armored plates were first found, they didn't look like fish at all. Instead, they resembled fragments of turtle shells, or even pieces of crustaceans. The heavy ornamentation on the bone plates, grooves, ridges, and patterns made them look more like decorative stones than parts of an animal. In some cases, fossil collectors actually polished Ostracoderm plates and sold them as curiosities, not realizing they were handling the remains of some of the earliest vertebrates. Imagine buying a paperweight in the 19th century only to learn later that it was part of a 400-million-year-old fish. One of the first scientists to seriously study these fossils was Louis Agassiz, a Swiss biologist and geologist. In the mid-19th century, Agassiz published a monumental work on fossil fishes, cataloging hundreds of species. Among them were the strange armored forms we now call Ostracoderms. Agassiz was fascinated by their unusual anatomy. He recognized that they were not turtles or crustaceans, but something entirely different: early fishes. His careful descriptions and illustrations helped establish them as a distinct group in the fossil record. Agassiz was so passionate about fossil fishes that he once said he could recognize a species from just a single scale. With Ostracoderms, however, he often had only fragments of armor to work with, making his task incredibly difficult. Even with Agassiz's work, Ostracoderms remained a puzzle for decades. Their lack of jaws confused scientists. How could a fish survive without jaws? Their heavy armor also seemed impractical. Some researchers thought they might be related to arthropods, while others suggested they were a strange kind of turtle. It wasn't until more complete fossils were discovered that their true nature became clear. These fossils showed the overall body shape, with tails, fins, and gill openings, features that confirmed they were indeed vertebrates. The term Ostracoderm itself is a bit misleading. It's not a scientific classification, but a convenient label for several different groups of armored, jawless fishes. Today, paleontologists recognize that Ostracoderms are paraphyletic, meaning they don't form a single natural group, but rather a collection of related lineages. Some of the most important Ostracoderm fossils have been found in Scotland. The old red sandstone deposits are rich in Devonian fishes, including Ostracoderms. North America, fossils have been found in Canada and the United States, showing that Ostracoderms were widespread. Russia and China, important discoveries here have revealed new species and helped clarify their evolutionary relationships. These fossil sites give us a global picture of Ostracoderm diversity. They were not confined to one region, they were a successful group that spread across ancient seas and rivers worldwide. In Scotland, fossil hunters in the 19th century often stumbled upon Ostracoderm remains while quarrying stone for buildings. Some of the very walls of old houses contained fragments of these ancient fishes. As paleontology advanced, scientists began to see Ostracoderms not just as curiosities, but as key players in the story of vertebrate evolution. Their fossils showed the transition from simple jawless fishes to more complex forms. They provided evidence for how vertebrates developed armor, fins, and new ways of feeding. By the 20th century, Ostracoderms were recognized as pioneers, early experiments in vertebrate design. They were no longer seen as oddities, but as essential chapters in the history of life. Some Ostracoderm fossils are so well preserved that scientists can study the microscopic structure of their bone tissue. This has revealed details about how their armor grew and even how their blood vessels were arranged. Today, we can even create 3D models of Ostracoderms showing how they might have moved and fed. In the early 20th century, some reconstructions gave Ostracoderms comically exaggerated features, like oversized fins or cartoonish armor. These mistakes remind us how much paleontology has advanced in just a century. Now that we've explored how Ostracoderms were discovered, let's turn to a fascinating question. Do they have any living relatives? Are there creatures today that can give us a glimpse into what these armored pioneers were like? The answer is yes, though the resemblance is not always obvious. To find their closest kin, we need to look at the jawless fishes that still survive today, the lampreys and the hagfish. Lampreys and hagfish belong to a group called the cyclostomes, meaning round mouths. Like Ostracoderms, they lack jaws. Instead, they have circular sucker-like mouths that allow them to latch onto surfaces, or in the case of lampreys, onto other fish. Lampreys are eel-like creatures with toothed, funnel-shaped mouths. Many species are parasitic, attaching themselves to other fish and rasping away flesh to feed on blood and body fluids. Hagfish, on the other hand, are scavengers. They feed on dead or dying animals, burrowing into carcasses and consuming them from the inside out. They are also famous for producing copious amounts of slime as a defense mechanism. At first glance, these slimy, eel-like creatures don't look much like the armored Ostracoderms, but when we look closer, the similarities become clear. Ostracoderms and cyclostomes share several important features. Both groups lack true jaws, relying instead on suction or rasping to feed. Cartilaginous skeletons, neither group has a fully ossified bony skeleton, simple body plans. Compared to jawed fishes, both are relatively simple in structure. Gill-based respiration, both rely on gills for breathing, though Ostracoderms were among the first to separate breathing from feeding. These similarities suggest that lampreys and hagfish are distant cousins of the Ostracoderms, preserving some of the primitive traits of early vertebrates. Of course, there are also major differences. Ostracoderms had heavy bony armor, while lampreys and hagfish have soft, flexible bodies. Some Ostracoderms developed paired fins, while lampreys and hagfish lack them. Ostracoderms were filter feeders, while lampreys are parasites and hagfish are scavengers. These differences show how evolution has taken jawless fishes down very different paths. Ostracoderms, however, were among the first vertebrates to use gills solely for respiration. They fed by sucking in water and sediment through their mouths, while their gills were dedicated to breathing. This innovation freed the gills from the dual task of feeding and respiration, paving the way for more efficient breathing systems in later vertebrates. It was a small step, but one with enormous consequences for the evolution of fishes, amphibians, and eventually all vertebrates. Despite their heavy armor, Ostracoderms were not cut off from their environment. Many had advanced sensory systems that helped them navigate and survive. Like modern fishes, some ostracoderms had a lateral line, a series of sensory organs that detect vibrations and movement in the water. This allowed them to sense predators or prey even in murky conditions. Some ostracoderms have electroreception, which some scientists believe ostracoderms may have had the ability to detect electric fields, much like modern sharks and rays. This would have been especially useful for finding food buried in sediment. Most ostracoderms lacked paired fins, making them clumsy swimmers. But some groups, like the cephalaspids, developed small pectoral fins. These fins gave them better control and maneuverability, allowing them to steer and stabilize themselves in the water. This was a crucial step in vertebrate evolution. Paired fins would eventually evolve into the forelimbs and hindlimbs of tetrapods. In a sense, the first step toward walking on land began with the tiny fins of ostracoderms. Fossil evidence suggests that cephalaspids could use their fins to hover above the seafloor, much like modern rays. This would have allowed them to feed more efficiently while avoiding predators. Every dynasty in the history of life eventually comes to an end. For the ostracoderms, their reign lasted more than 100 million years, an extraordinary achievement by any measure. But by the close of the Devonian period, around 360 million years ago, these armored pioneers vanished forever. Their extinction was not sudden like the asteroid that doomed the dinosaurs, but gradual. The oceans themselves were also changing. Oxygen levels fluctuated, climate shifted, and habitats transformed. Shallow seas that had once been ideal for ostracoderms sometimes dried up or became inhospitable. The Devonian period saw not just the rise of fishes, but also the first forests on land. Plants like Archaeopteris grew tall, altering the carbon cycle and changing the chemistry of rivers and seas. These changes may have indirectly affected ostracoderms by altering their freshwater habitats. Early sharks were sleek and fast, able to outswim and outmaneuver their prey. Compared to these newcomers, ostracoderms were slow, clumsy, and limited in their feeding strategies. Their filter-feeding lifestyle worked well in stable environments, but in a world of agile predators and competitors, it became a disadvantage. In addition to competition, ostracoderms faced environmental stress. The Devonian was marked by several extinction events, sometimes called the late Devonian crises. Some Devonian extinction events were selective, hitting marine bottom dwellers especially hard. Ostracoderms, unfortunately, fit that category perfectly. Ironically, the very trait that had once protected ostracoderms, their heavy armor, may have contributed to their downfall. By the end of the Devonian, ostracoderms were gone. Yet their disappearance was not the end of the story. In fact, their extinction cleared the way for the rise of jawed fishes, which would go on to dominate the seas and eventually give rise to amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and humans. The extinction of ostracoderms is sometimes seen as a classic example of evolutionary replacement, one group fading away as another, more advanced group takes over. Although they are long extinct, ostracoderms left an enduring legacy. Without ostracoderms, the story of vertebrates, including us, would have been very different. So, what can we learn from the ostracoderms? They remind us that evolution is not a straight line, but a branching tree full of experiments. Some experiments succeed and flourish, others fade away. Ostracoderms were one of those experiments, armored, jawless, and strange, but also innovative and important. They were the first knights of the sea, clad in armor, defending themselves in a dangerous world. They may have been slow and awkward, but they survived for over 100 million years. The next time you look in the mirror, remember, deep in your evolutionary past, you are connected to those armored pioneers of the Paleozoic seas. The ostracoderms may be extinct, but their story is eternal.